Okay, well, welcome everybody. Thanks a lot for joining us today for this online launch event of the book Amidst the Debris, Humanitarianism and the End of Liberal Order. Flash of copies. The book was published or came out last month on the 10th of June in the UK. I think it'll be coming out next month, if I'm not mistaken, in the US, and will be available in other parts of the world then too. The book is a product of relationships that have been developed over a number of years, and relationships with people who are here, not just the editors but authors. So thanks to all of those who are here. My name is Juliano Fury. I'm one of the editors of the book, but I'm also head of studies on humanitarian affairs at the NGO Save the Children in the UK. And I'm very lucky to be joined by three of our brilliant contributing authors today. So we have Nimi Gauri-Nathan, who's currently in the US, who's an activist and scholar, and a founder of the Politics of Sexual Violence Initiative at City College, New York, where she's also a visiting research professor. We have Olivia Herrera-Rutazibra, who's in the UK at the moment, who's a senior lecturer at Portsmouth University. And we have Simon Reed-Henry, who's in Norway and is a reader in geography, as well as the director of the Institute for the Humanities and the Social Sciences at Queen Mary University, London. I'm also very glad that we're joined today by a fantastic discussant, who is Charlotte Lydia Riley, who is a lecturer in 20th century British history at the University of Southampton. And she specializes also in empire, its legacies, in labor politics, and particularly labor foreign policy and overseas aid. Just a few words on format first. This is intended as a conversation, so we're not going to be doing formal presentations. That means that we really want it to be as interactive with those who are joining now, as well as the panelists. So everybody's welcome to chip in at some stage, whether you're a contributor to the book at some stage or not. There is a chat function where you can post your questions or comments if you'd like them to be read out for you. I'll try to keep an eye on those, and if I don't manage to do that, Andrea Rigon, who's one of the other editors, has offered to help out pointing those out to me. You can also put your hand up. There's a raise hand function, I think, in the reactions setting below. So if you click on reactions, you can then raise your hand, and if I see that, then you can come on screen with your camera on or camera off and ask your question yourself if you like. So as I said, this book is a product of relationships that have been developed over a number of years, initially between institutions, so between Save the Children's Humanitarian Affairs team, in which I work with Fernando Espada, who is one of the other editors and is here online with us. And first of all, the Humanitarian and Conflict Response Institute at the University of Manchester, where we have been working primarily with Bertrand Tate, who's director there and is also one of the editors and is also online. And then with Andrea Rigon at the Bartlett Development Planning Unit at University College London. But in fact, it's not really an institutional relationship that produced the book. It's a relationship between people and people who became friends quite early on in the research partnerships. After the four of us started talking about the book, we then also were lucky enough to welcome Rafia Zakaria on board. She had attended a conference on the occasion of Save the Children's centenary, and it had caused something of a stir. I'm sure she won't mind me saying, and it was good to get her involved early on, and she made a great contribution. I think she's here with us too. So as well, I should also mention that many of the authors who have been involved, Mark here, Klaus, have had some engagement with the Humanitarian Affairs team over time. And I think the types of relationships that we've built with the authors is reflective of the kind of work that we've been interested in. So it's not so much a study of humanitarian practices as the politics of humanitarianism, looking often not so much at the micro as the macro, how humanitarianism functions in different forms of government, thinking about the political economy of humanitarianism. And this has lent itself to the kind of research that we've done with HCRI and with DPU. And increasingly over recent years, we've been thinking about and exploring what Didier Fassin, the anthropologist, has called humanitarian reason. That's a type of humanitarian government, humanitarianism in processes of ordering. And so that brings me on to the theme of the book. Why this theme, humanitarianism and liberal order? And I should say already that the end of liberal order in the subtitle is a provocation. Well, we had a sense that humanitarianism in some sense came back, returned to center stage in politics in the West, exactly at the moment in which liberal democracies and the progressive neoliberal pact that seemed to have held them together was unsettled. So around the middle of the last decade, a surge or an increase in flows of migrants and refugees to Europe and North America in particular contributed to changing the political and ideological landscape in the West. Immigration, borders, universal rights, search and rescue in the Mediterranean, these became objects of intensified contestation. And they were triggers perhaps for a radicalization of a moral antagonism that was already building. Politics of life itself was then dragged into what have often been called the culture wars, which I understand to be the mobilization of moral values and cultural custom in pursuit of hegemony. It's clear now, at least to me, that this resulted in a shift to the right in politics in the West. That certainly many of the movements that emerged from this period were figureheaded by a new right. And we only need to look at some of the leaders of these movements, and obviously they aren't entirely representative of them, but the Orbans, the Le Pen, Salvini, Trump, Farage, even Johnson, to understand what is reflected politically in these movements. And this then I think contributed to a sense among liberal commentators and politicians, those more generally in society of a liberal disposition, of a liberal politics, to a sort of anxiety, contributed to the production of a considerable body of angsty writing on liberalism and its possible decline. And obviously the decline of liberalism or the end of liberalism is a secular theme, it's a recurring theme in modern history. But certainly at this moment, the idea that liberalism, and in fact more generally the West, that embodied liberalism, liberal ideas, liberal politics, was in decline, contributed to principally to forming a new sort of political discourse. So our book is trying to respond in some sense to that anxiety. We're trying to interrogate the idea of the end of liberal order, the collapse of liberalism. Now, there's different takes on that within the book. Some authors agree that liberalism is in crisis. Others challenge that in different ways. We try to look at what elements of liberal order are in fact in crisis, if they are in crisis. And certainly Bertrand, who is our professional historian among the editors, was particularly keen not to reproduce the idea prematurely of an end. Historians tend to be wary of calling the end too early. That said, we do feel that something has changed over the last decade. There are considerable challenges to a consensus that seem to have been steady for a period. But how long that period is also to be discussed. Already at the end of the 1990s, those who were critical of the liberal enthusiasm of the end of the Cold War were suggesting that after the Kosovo intervention, for example, that liberal order couldn't be seen to be as permanent as it had presumed to be before. Certainly then with 9/11 and subsequent invasions of Afghanistan and then Iraq, there was a sense that politics or maybe even history had returned. Some thought that meant that humanitarianism had been sidelined. Others thought that in fact the global war on terror was nothing more than the installation or the establishment of a permanent state of exception, and therefore was revealing the dark side of humanitarian biopolitics. Even certain liberal commentators and analysts, people like Fareed Zakaria, thought that this was now the end of history, and what was needed was for a reinvention of liberalism. Clearly that didn't come soon enough, and with the financial crisis of 2007 to 2008, a number of rebellions, social rebellions, insurgencies, molecular revolutions, whatever you'd like to call them, seemed to demonstrate a crisis of legitimacy for liberal order. And on the periphery, this was often treated in the same way as some of the crises or conflicts of the 1990s. And I think that then came to demonstrate in the way that humanitarian narratives were mobilized, that in fact, humanitarianism as a discourse, humanitarianism as an ethics, had less strategic currency than it previously did. And at the same time, a sort of minimalist politics of humanitarianism seemed to continue to influence the way that politics was happening within Western countries. So it's worth me just touching on definitions here. Humanitarianism, as it's understood by some of the authors, but I suppose if we take a collective understanding based on the book, what humanitarianism is, what it means, we're talking about a broad conception of humanitarianism. It's not limited to operational activity across borders in response to conflict and disaster necessarily, but a sort of minimalist and universalist politics of human life. Then liberal order, what are we talking about when we talk about liberal order? That's perhaps slightly trickier. There are obviously debates about whether liberal order has ever existed, whether international order can be liberal or has been liberal. And what we try to do really is take liberal order as a category at face value. That is, it's an object of the imagination of liberals and many of their critics. But it's also a dynamic normative construction. That is to say that liberal ideas can be projected to reinforce certain dynamics and hierarchies, to create institutions, and ultimately to concentrate power in different ways. The book deals with three main questions. The first then is, what is the relationship, or what has been the relationship between humanitarianism and liberal order? The second is this the end? Is this the end of liberal order? Indeed. And the third is, what are the implications for humanitarianism of these apparent challenges to liberalism and liberal order? We'll get into discussing these. The book has various different takes, various different perspectives, various different politics infuse the writing. But I think all the authors try to take a sort of critical distance from liberal humanitarianism without sort of reverting to invective that would exclude liberal ideas from anything that might surpass liberal capitalism. Based on that introduction, I'm going to pass over to Charlotte rather than to the other authors, so that she can give you her reflections as an outsider to the book and its production on the topic, on the book itself, and how it relates to contemporary debates. So over to you, Charlotte. Thanks.
Thanks. Thank you so much, Juliano, for such a rich introduction as well, which I think really brought out some of the themes of the book. And thank you to all the contributors for producing such a rich and interesting text. And I think really one of the strengths of this book is the fact, not only, as Juliano says, do these contributors come from kind of different political spaces and different interpretive spaces, but also the kind of different academic and practitioner backgrounds that people are bringing to this means that this is a really kind of holistic view of humanitarianism, not only kind of in different regions, but also conceptually and from different approaches, which I think, really kind of benefits the book. I think the book raises incredibly important questions, not least because it roots humanitarianism within a political and a historic space. So I think, you know, a lot of the time when we're writing about humanitarianism, and I would absolutely include myself in this as well, we become very interested in, perhaps a little fixated on the principles of humanitarianism. And I think principles are very important, but so too are how those principles work in practice. And I think thinking about both historic and political context for humanitarianism helps us to kind of draw out the connections between, and also I suppose sometimes the gap between principles and what's actually happening in the real world. So Juliano, obviously in your introduction, you talked a little about the kind of context of this book's production and this moment of populism, perhaps the sort of rise of the right in Britain, in America, across Europe. And the rise, it feels to many of us, I think, of a kind of harder, less generous, less sympathetic mode of political engagement, which changes perhaps popular ideas about humanitarianism, which changes the way in which humanitarianism is received by a broader public. It's probably worth pointing out that many of the undercurrents of anti-humanitarian thought were always there. We have often, particularly in Britain, you know, as a British historian, we've often kind of reassured ourselves about our humanitarian credentials as a nation, but actually, you know, populism has risen these critiques to the surface very quickly in a way that implies that, in fact, this was probably always something that was present in British society. There was not always a kind of constant support for this, but this shift towards this harder politics, I think, is very concerning, and is certainly something that kind of creates a particular context for this work. The British context right now, you know, yesterday, I was sort of on tenterhooks thinking, will I be able to talk in this in this talk about how, you know, the British Parliament kind of snatched back aid spending from a populist government? You know, will the MPs kind of stand up to Boris Johnson and vote against these aid cuts? And of course they didn't. The cuts have gone through, despite the fact that Britain has a statutory duty to spend 0.7% of GNI on aid spending. This has now been reduced to 0.5. And the only guarantee that this will be increased back up to the 0.7 target is when this is fiscally possible, which is a guarantee that is essentially meaningless. As well, some of the contributors pointed out in their chapter, Emily Bourne, for example, in her chapter, pointed out that the Johnson government also recently rolled DFID up into the Foreign and Commonwealth Office in Britain, and DFID no longer exists as its own department. And I would point out as a historian of aid that this is very much in line with historic conservative approaches to aid. This is always something the Conservative Party has done, but it certainly illustrates a particular British context for thinking about aid and development and humanitarianism in this moment. So as a historian, I'm not going to speak for all historians, but as a historian, I think perhaps historians, when they're thinking about aid and development and humanitarianism, can do two things. So firstly, we look at aid policy in history, in the past, and we think about how it's evolved over time, right? This is the most kind of basic thing that historians of humanitarianism do. We think about the historic context of the development of aid and humanitarianism, and this book posits that part of that context is the liberal order. Right, and we understand it within a historic context. And I think we can problematize that context. We can think about things like imperialism and decolonization and neo-imperialism, and think about how these two things connect, for example, which is something that many of the contributors in the book and some of the speakers today have done themselves as well. I think one of the questions I'm really interested in that kind of came to my mind when I was reading the book that I haven't fully worked through myself yet is, does empire problematize the liberal order, or does it in fact underpin it? Like, can we understand the liberal order without understanding it as a product of empire and the end of empire? Historians might think about how humanitarianism and aid have evolved historically. We might think about how recipients and donors, head offices and field workers, governments and international organizations have existed in history, and how they exist today, and how they've changed over time, and what the continuities are and what the differences are, right? That's something historians can do. The second thing historians can do is think about the present through the lens of the past. And I'm always very skeptical of the ideas of lessons from history. I don't think history exists to explain the present. I don't think we can always take lessons from history which would be, you know, are by their nature decontextualized and stripped of any kind of meaningful engagement with their context, I think. But we can and should historicize the present, and we should historicize the idea of aid and humanitarianism. We need to understand how it's been constructed, through a process of conflict and consensus across decades or perhaps across centuries. So I think that's kind of what historians can sometimes bring to this, or what we maybe think we can bring to this debate. And I think a key question here, and a key question that the book really made me think of, is can humanitarianism escape the past? You know, how far is humanitarianism permanently rooted in its origins? Is it something we can only understand by reference to its past and to where it's come from? In my own work, I explore the intersections and the contusions between the British Empire, the British left, and gender history and humanitarianism. So I've recently written a piece about the Labour Party's attitude towards morality in aid, and the way that it uses aid as a kind of way of talking about morality on the world stage. I've written about the the International Women's Conferences and the ways that these demonstrated kind of intersections between the feminist movement and the aid industry. And I think, you know, in my own work, I'm very aware that structures like imperialism and patriarchy are structures that we can trace through history, and they're structures that exist within this period we think of as the liberal order, right? And they are things that shape the subjects of the liberal order's interactions with that and their experiences of it. Like, you cannot escape these identities, however much liberalism might want us to do so. You cannot escape those identities of race, of class, of gender, of political alignment, and that shapes humanitarianism too. As a British historian, my work brings these questions back to the metropole, and often explores how humanitarianism kind of shapes donors as well as recipients, and how the British state and the British people think about humanitarianism as being part of their identity, part of the British state, part of Britain's identity on the world stage. Humanitarianism in Britain, I think, is often a smokescreen which seeks to deny inequalities at home and seeks to turn refugees at borders, even while speaking glowingly of Britain's kind of humanitarian past. Right? This is it's a space in which people can make claims to identity as much as it is something that we can talk about as being kind of key principles for action. And I think one of the things the book helps us to do is, or help me to do, is to think about how this kind of national context that I often find myself kind of trapped in is situated within a much broader conceptual space, and how that we can't kind of separate these national questions within these broader conceptual spaces, but we also can't understand these broader kind of wider international contexts without bringing it back down to this point. And so I think a really critical question of the book is, if this is the end of the liberal order, the final question that Juliana posed, you know, how does this threaten humanitarianism? And I think we need to think about this possibly, or we could think about this possibly, in terms of good threats and bad threats. How does the end to the liberal order actually provide a space in which humanitarianism could escape some of its more constraining or perhaps more problematic historic structures? Are there possibilities in this moment as well as perils? Or is this something, or is the liberal order and humanitarianism so closely connected that the end of one is necessarily the end of the other? So how can we think about this perhaps as a moment which might, as I said, enable humanitarianism to move towards escaping its past, rather than feeling that it will be brought down by the end of this context that it has apparently been so comfortable within? So I don't really want to say more than that, because we have the other speakers here as well, but they were sort of some of my initial thoughts.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much, Charlotte. And I think the last question is a very pertinent one, and it's one that's addressed directly by a number of the chapters, particularly in the last section, which I think is entitled Post-Liberal Humanitarianism ? Or something like that. In fact, it's addressed by Olivia, in a sense, in her idea of a decolonial retrieval of humanitarianism. It's addressed directly by Patricia Daly in her chapter, which considers the possibility of an anti-racist humanitarianism. And I think that that relationship between the national and the international, both, or one being constitutive of the other, is important, not just to us understanding what might come next, but us and analyzing what has been. And I think that actually brings us quite nicely to Nimi's chapter, Because Nimi, you in your chapter, you engage beautifully and poetically with structure, with the reproduction of neocolonial structures and imperial structures, and also with experience, and experience at a national level, and from the perspective of somebody who has worked in aid, but then has also taken distance from it and has been able to observe it critically. So maybe you can say a few words on your chapter, how it relates to what has already been said.
Yeah, thanks, Juliano. And I want to thank Rafael also for inviting me to contribute with some reflections with a piece that was really grappling with my own positioning, sort of inside and outside this kind of ordering of subjugated peoples as an accidental aid worker of sorts. In reference to what Charlotte was talking about, it is more for me, this piece, how to escape some of the identities that are thrust upon you. And ordering, understanding ordering as a practice that was both elitist in its acceptance of me and racist in its suspicions of me. And how this is all revealed in these moments that are branded as a crisis. And I think what's revealed, again, thinking about what Charlotte has said, rather than looking at this kind of shifting shell of harder or softer, more empathetic political narrative, but digging a bit deeper at the political structures that are consistent across the regimes, that are built on very racist foundations. If you look at something like immigration and Obama versus Trump, right, being able to see the through lines rather than offering a way out through narratives, that are covering up these through lines, and looking at how in a crisis a political moment is captured, sort of in still frame, even as its fractures continue to spread, separating the dispossessed from power. So I'm going to do, and it was an opportunity also to be able to, in some ways, pay my respects to a local organization called the Tamil Rehabilitation Organization that I worked with very closely for many years, that was working inside rebel-controlled territory in Sri Lanka, and was a really unique effort to repoliticize aid inside of the weight of an international sort of force trying to depoliticize the work that this group was doing. And so I'm going to do actually a reading from the essay because, as with most of my work, it's quite difficult to describe, but it's written in a way, as is my recent book, where the fragments and flow are meant to mimic the actual experiences of violence and repression. So I'll do a reading from a few of the sections of the book. Of the essay. To be inhumane is to lack qualities of compassion and mercy, to border on the cruel and barbaric. A secular compassion is, of course, built into the mission statements of charitable groups, some taking care to cover the directives drawn directly from God or the American president. In the aftermath of moments when the earth shook across war-ravaged South Asian landscapes, my younger self would bear witness to Scientologists guiding confused preschoolers in chants, Korean church groups integrating the gospel and play therapy, American government-funded aid groups exchanging food for information. The kind of contemporary interventionism legitimized in terms of a moral obligation rather than a political principle. The bewildered, mourning, and dispossessed are at the mercy of the intervener's intent. The second section is from Cox's Bazaar from my trip in 2018 in the refugee camps. The chief of the camp is pleased that my level of education might transfer Western credit to his efforts. This must be the most organized camp you've ever seen, Professor, no? Isn't it beautiful? The view from the vantage point of hovering drones and military aircrafts matches his own. Clear lines, an ode to order. Beautiful to some. It is a kind of order that, after the summits and pleasantries, the liberal imaginary expects the humanitarian industry to enforce. Under the cover of neutrality, it reproduces a worldview divided, as Mahmoud Mamdani notes, into two unequal parts, one privileged, the other subjugated. To me, there's always been something sinister about these spaces, each of us tripping over ourselves to avoid the dark shadow of the camp. The performance of humanitarian purity didn't interest me anymore. A refugee, Sarah, from the Kachin community asked, "What if you are an IDP all the time? What are you called?" A person displaced internally. Growing up inside a rebel family, the fight to survive was ingrained. Why is nationalism seen as an illegitimate struggle? Why is it a bad word? Sarah asked, assuming I might have an answer. If the Buddhists can exist inside a Buddhist nation, surely the Kachin and Rohingya had the right to their own line of control. Instead, she says, we, my people, are in IDP camps, moving all the time. We cannot be nationalists. We are all reduced to being monkeys, dancing for the NGOs for food. The second fragment is from a courtroom from an asylum case in the United Kingdom, where I was the expert witness for the director of the same community-based group, the Tamil Rehabilitation Organization, whose asylum case was being decided. Over time, I would learn that these white Anglo-American courtrooms were the looking glass through which the conventional view of darker nations would occasionally be challenged, but most often reinforced. The judge's questioning would move in contortions of power, legal language casting the net to catch a native. Was the defendant affiliated with a terrorist organization? How often did I visit to check on these local aid workers whose post-colonial capacity had not yet built trust? I am asked to reaffirm an existing order, parsing politics from humanitarianism. I hear my own voice speaking their language, methodology, monitoring and evaluation. I am constructing a quantifiable case for his humanity through their tools of measurement. To do otherwise would be to strip the desperate camouflage from every brown person in the room, relying on the facade of humanitarianism to relieve liberal anxieties. The big man was right that Cox's Bazaar was the logical extreme of organizational tidiness that I may have expected but had never seen in my years of humanitarian work. Squares, distribution graphs, boxes. A humanitarianism so enamored of its own precise geometry, it need not ever mention the not quite human beings inside the lines. I'll stop there and we can have a bigger conversation later about the themes.
Thanks a lot, Nimi. And as Olivia wrote in the chat, Nimi's chapter is beautifully written, extremely poignant, and connects, as you would have heard there, aspects of life within the humanitarian sector to a broader politics. And I think Olivia's chapter does that in a different way, taking a broader conception of the humanitarian sector to include university departments that study humanitarianism, and how what we study and how we study it is embedded in a broader politics, in particular in a post-colonial politics. And so maybe Olivia, you can connect your chapter to what Nimi has presented there.
Thank you very much, and I also want to join the thanks for including me in this project. The patience that some editors, Juliano, I'm not going to name you by name, but have shown, but also just also the times we had a chance to meet each other. It's been really like a generative space to think about this. I titled my contribution, which is the last chapter, What's There to Mourn, What's There to Celebrate, the Colonial Retrieval of Humanitarianism. And what I will do is very briefly read out the first paragraph, and then I'll just share some of the things that I think that this contribution tried to do. So I start by saying all over the globe, we have seen fascism, racism, and xenophobic nationalism resurfacing in what we once thought of as respectable democracies. Following a particularly bleak weekend at the end of October 2018, the election of Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, reports of worsening famine in Yemen, Israeli bombardment of Gaza, the murder of 11 worshippers at a refugee harboring synagogue in Pittsburgh, My colleague, Dr. Sarah Salem of the London School of Economics tweeted, "It's difficult watching political scientists scrambling to understand what's happening around the world today, as if there haven't been people theorizing racism, nationalism, empire, and gender for a century and warning of exactly what we see now." So today, the handling of the COVID-19 pandemic, that's me following on, and the reignited Black Lives Matter protest following the police killings of George Floyd painfully underscore how a systematic disregard for certain lives continue to be the organizing principle of the post-colonial world order. So the comments I want to make, but also I think the context of the way in which I have tried to address in the chapter the questions of the book, they're there. And I wanted to start with that to show how both contingent but also super continuous these things are, and how do we make sense of that, especially epistemically. I always think that I'm not going to talk for very long, so I've taught myself how to give 3 keywords of what I hope to engage with, and then we'll see how it goes, whether it's in this intervention or in the Q&A. But what I want to spend most of my time here is the concept or the idea of the lie, not as just a moral and ethical accusation, but as an analytical framework to engage with the questions that are on the table. Secondly, what I've tried to do in the chapter, and I think it will be more for the Q&A, but is trying to think how decolonization can be one of the many tools at our disposal as a strategy to engage some of the problematics that we might define. I also want to underscore it's not the only one, and I also want to underscore that a lot of serious commodification work has been done around decolonization. So I'm not here to defend any labels, but I think there is still some radical purchase that we can retrieve from it. And then lastly, the way I've been trying in the updated version of this chapter to think about what might be the goal that we can retrieve decolonially from the humanitarian project is something to do with, I've called here, and again, not wedded to concept, but something to do with indiscriminate life in dignity. And I kept life quite open and even beyond the human, I think, for the many reasons that you can imagine. But there is something there that, that helps me think through not just being negative, cynical, destructive, or the minimal understanding of abolitionism, which would be break down the whole thing. But the generative understanding of abolitionism is like, what do we need to think constructively after we've decided the things that we really need to get let go of for the possibility of life? It's not even much more complicated than that. So I've been compelled, let me start with the concept of the lie, and I'll spend most of my time on that, but I've been compelled, as I said, by the potential analytical purchase of the concept of the lie. And part of it, a lot of it is actually inspired by a growing and recurrent impatience on my end with how we try to make sense of the world. And I'm like really a Zen person, so I'm not impatient or nervous in general, right? But there is something in my politics that has become much more clear where I feel I can't even rejoice, let's say last summer, to see so many people in the streets protesting against police violence against Black bodies and chanting Black Lives Matters. The impatience I feel is sometimes the modality in which that happens. It's surprise, it feels like something new. We didn't know racism was that bad, all of that. I think I've started to see that as much less innocent mistakes or blinders, but as a thing that constitutively make part of what we call the liberal order or humanitarianism for the last 60 years. Carry on, and then maybe we flag up some of its problems in more technical or apolitical ways, the way it's been already discussed. There is something there that we should be much more strong in terms of our refusal of that. And part of it, I think, is housed and is perpetuated through our analytics. It's not just that, obviously, but that's what I'm focusing on. So in a way, I think the focus or the zooming in on the concept of the lie is very simplistically an attempt to save time. Not just to be right, not to always be right, but literally how can we save time in trying to understand what goes horribly wrong in what we're studying. So the idea of the lie, I've been thinking about how, and it's in the last year and a half, I think, that it crystallized something that I was already thinking. But on the one hand, by my friend and colleague, Professor Siba Grobogi, who's a political theorist, during a conference, it was such a simple statement that he made, but it stuck with me. He's the type of person that knows more than Wikipedia. I know that's not an endorsement, but you know, these people that forensically know everything that ever happened in the world. He made the very simple observation that he said, and I think he was talking about the US, and I forgot what time frame he gave us, but he says all interventions, whether humanitarian or other, in the last X amount of years, and it was a really long time, barring one, and I also forgot which one, were based on lies, right? And it's a super simple statement. And we all know that we went into Iraq with the wrong reasons, Afghanistan, all of that. But how does it work for us to be able to observe that? But it doesn't seem to have radical constitutive implications in how we even think of intervention. And when I say we, I'm obviously generalizing, right? But just to understand that, like, all interventions that we've done, the way that they've been justified and all of that, if all of them were based in one or the other way on a lie, it should have a much huger impact on how we teach these things, rather than just almost in a footnote mentioning that there weren't weapons of mass destruction, right? So that's the first thing I just wanted to flag up. The other, and that's the thing that I elaborated a little bit in the chapter, is inspired by a recent book that came out from Eddie Glaude, where he engages with the thought of James Baldwin. And James Baldwin also speaks about the lie. He does more than speaking about it, but his work is framed as bearing witness to. And I think that's another epistemological move that I think might be quite useful for us to think about. And he's quite specific about what type of lie he's speaking about. And it's the lie of the value gap of life and all the institutions in society designed to keep that gap in place. And again, as an analytic, I think it is a useful way to try and think, where does the humanitarian liberal order fit into that? And we can come back to this in the Q&A. And what I find striking, and I'll try to wrap up here, is that he speaks very specifically about African-American existence within the context of a white supremacist US. But again, as an epistemological intervention here, what I've been more and more compelled by as well is to, in the same logic of trying to save some time and lives, that thinking through epistemic Blackness, and with Blackness, I mean first and foremost political Blackness, but I embody it, focusing specifically on people of African descent, their experiences, their philosophies. How also that as an epistemic move would save us so much time, because it doesn't require that much elaboration to speak about the lie if the center of the place from which you theorize and philosophize is not necessarily the westernized humanitarian and the different structures that we look at, but people on the receiving end, not as victims, not as testimonials, not as just, but as those that help us theorize, the BS that the whole system is, regardless of the intentions put in by different individuals and those that participate into this, right? So let me see how to close this up. I think what some of these points that I made help us to do is to, both flag up and maybe pierce through this ritualized surprise on the one hand, also very much issues of amnesia. And I think Charlotte really spoke about history, and I think it's, apart from acknowledging or historicize it, engaging with systematically colonial amnesia, I think might be quite helpful in that regard, but also disregard of life, trampling of dignity, the racism that we don't like to talk about, but also very much the paternalistic lie of aid and help. And I would say the most important one is to reframe these questions, not in technocratic ways, but really in terms of life and death. And that's obviously the actual paradox in humanitarianism, because the whole system is built on the claim to attend to life and death. But in the end, I think a lot of the ways that we study it, and I'm not even talking about how we practice it, does quite the opposite. I think I will end here by just merely maybe saying, and I can elaborate on that in the Q&A as well. I remember when we were preparing, Nimi invited us to think through very concrete examples when we were going to make some of our point, or at least grounded in actuality. And in my case, it's very much being of random descent and trying to make sense of not just obviously the genocide in '94, but also very much this international community that lives at on the eve of the genocide, right? For me, it's been something that has inspired me to, like, it cannot just be a footnote or something that we mention. It's actually the constitutive point from which we need to try and engage with this humanitarian order. That is not, it's not a footnote, right? And so I wanted to end with that, again, not to, it is dramatic, so I don't need extra dramatizing or not, but just to connect to this, the actuality of the life and death invitation in this conversation. I'll end here. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Olivia. And I think that idea of approaching the lie, approaching pretext from the foundation of experience is one that is probably present in a few of the chapters, particularly in the last section. Simon, your chapter approaches the questions posed by the book from a different starting point, from a different perspective. It's a chapter of intellectual history, broad in its sweep, and yet at the same time, it's often dealing with an inside-outside, with the national and the international, in the sense that you're talking about a defensive disposition that emerged within liberalism, but also how that resulted in a certain type of external interaction, particularly from within the US, how a certain type of, or a certain set of foreign interventions became necessary to support a defensive liberalism at home. Maybe you can give us an overview of your chapter and then try and tie it back into some of the questions that have already been raised.
Yeah, thanks very much, Juliano, and thanks, Charlotte, also for your really interesting comments, which will be great to come back to in the discussion afterwards. And likewise, Nimi and Olivia, really appreciate what both your chapters, first of all, but also what you brought out of those today. And I think in a way, I mean, the easiest way to kind of form a link with my chapter, which is titled Political Minimalism, which is in a sense an effort to write a history of a particular style of liberalism. So it does, as you say, Juliano, come up with questions from a different starting point. But in a sense, it's getting at the same coalface. I mean, the link really here is what is it that stands behind and sustains the lie, as you've been describing it, Olivia? What is it that builds that normative self-regard and insistence and disregard for alternatives and some experiences and some lives rather than others? So, you know, I mean, I guess at heart, the chapter is based upon the observation that liberalism therefore changes. That is what the sustenance of the lie does to it. It is forced to change, and there are particular variants and strands of liberalism that operate in different contexts and in response to certain perceived threats. This is where I suppose the defensive part of the argument comes from. And just to clarify as well, it's very much a sense of perceived threats and an asserted need for defense rather than that perhaps being a genuine need or requirement. But yes, the assumption is, Juliano, as you say, that it's an intellectual history of liberal thought since approximately the Second World War, focused, of course, primarily upon the US, which is the center of hegemony of political hegemony through this period, and you know that vision of liberalism, that view of the world, and it is a world view, is based upon the idea of human life as aggregate value. And of course, that aggregation leads to a number of things. One is it leads to the delegitimization of those that fall outside of a presumed prioritized or desired way of life or mode of life or even visible mode of life. And it also falls back upon what I then get into, which is this minimalist politics of delivery of aspects of liberalism that can survive the onslaught of world politics in that period. And the aspect of liberalism that is deemed to survive is one that's very much based upon a model of the primacy of individual liberty rather than one of solidarity or equality. And what the chapter tries to do, in a sense, is trace out the contradictions of that claim and the very real structures that it leads to in defense of that vision. So, you know, the result is a minimalist politics of life in which diversity and political creativity have been deemed part of the threat to a kind of regulative, conservative model. And conservative in a way that is completely separate to a left-right politics of the period. This is something that there is buy-in to across the political divide. And the way in which I try to sort of nail that down is to say, okay, well, it's not necessarily therefore a particular ideological form. It's also not necessarily a particular political structure in the way that we talk about, for example, neoliberalism, and I offer partly a history of that movement. It's also not simply political realism, which in the world of international relations, as you'll be more than aware of, Olivia, is also sort of a dominant conservative trait during the mid-century period, and we live in the echoes of it still today. More than all of those things, what I try to get at is this kind of underlying ethos, and I use that term, which is in a sense, you know, what stands behind and gives a kind of moral certainty to the claims of political liberalism during this period. So the way in which I try to demonstrate that is through a reading of certain key authors during this period. I start with Judith Shklar. I move on through John Rawls. But in both cases, I'm trying to point out how they are situated within this wider frame. So Shklar, for example, though she's often thought about as being very much a kind of Cold War liberal, kind of hawkish kind of approach, actually she is one of the first people to pick up on the fact that this political minimalism is this recognition that there is no greater good, that there is no larger purpose, there is no utopia in that sense worth fighting for. The only utopia that is worth having is the one that can be defended from the worst of all political evil. And of course, that political evil as a category becomes normativized. It becomes used as a justification for the sorts of interventions that we've just been hearing about. That is what those are often based upon. We will go there and we will fix those wrongs, and those wrongs are invariably deemed to be political wrongs. And so this exclusion of the socio-economic, first of all, which of course is often one of the underlying forms of inequality upon which those crises as they erupt, as Nimi was very eloquently talking about, kind of actually have been produced over many years, if not decades, if not centuries, becomes, as I say, this ultimate lie that political minimalism seeks to assert. And the twist in the tail, if you like, is that from the 1970s onwards, with the resurgence of a rhetoric of human rights in particular, but also the resurgence of a particular form of crusading humanitarianism. And of course, that becomes, if you know, those of you who are familiar with Michael Barnett's history of humanitarianism across the longue durée will recognize that kind of moment of resurgence of a kind of crusading humanitarianism. That then becomes the vehicle through which the Western liberal self speaks back to the world upon which it's done so much injustice and said, we will emancipate you with the human right, with this minimalist vision of a politics of life that actually has very little to do with the real concerns on the ground in any of those places where it's actively being projected. And it's that irony, that source of misunderstanding, as it were, for the liberal self that I think explains a lot of that kind of 1990s literature around, well, first of all, from the paradoxical literature, if you like, of the sort of the end of history in Fukuyama's sense, but the end of that kind of liberal sense of primacy, and this sense that, well, through the sort of resurgent United Nations, through the institutions of liberal international order, through what has been called kind of humanity law, we have this newly civilizing mission that is based upon these regulative principles of rights, of law, of jurisdiction, of territory. And that facade, in a sense, is such an empty structure that immediately, and 20, 25 years later is already beginning to fall apart. And so again, I absolutely concur with what Nimi was saying, that the idea that these problems have suddenly been thrust upon us is itself a part of that story of, as I say, disregard, of misunderstanding, of refusal to see what is before you. But what my chapter tries to do is to say, well, what is it that sustains that disregard? And it is this sense that actually what we've achieved is this kind of primacy of a form of liberalism that we can secure, that we can defend, and that needs to be defended if it's to survive. And that is an archly conservative form of liberalism. And I think it gives rise to a lot of the challenges that we see in the international realm today. Humanitarianism in its current period of crisis included, but certainly not limited to that. And again, I think, Charlotte, you were raising some questions at the start around what is the, getting beyond this question of what is the relationship between principle and practice. And I think that's absolutely right, because what matters is the way that principles are turned into practice and the grounds upon which that's done. And I think, the book as a whole actually does, not just my chapter, I think the book as a whole does this really well. It is itself such a brilliant collection of I don't know how many chapters you have got, Juliano, in there. Yeah, a lot. But that provides us with just a sort of fragmented prism that we need to understand this, right? Because there is no one single starting point. Olivia comes at it from one point of view, Nimi from another, I and the other co-authors, we've got some of them, Mark among them on the call today. And you need that to understand it. There is no singular narrative, but there are absolutely through lines, as you say, Nimi, and they're the ones that we need to try and understand. So through the sort of slightly, antiquarian mode of intellectual history, that's what I try to paint a picture of. Yes, it is partly focused on the US. Yes, the story is much more than just the US, but I try to at least concretize the story by doing that, and to do so in a way that opens up a point of view that will allow us to think of how do we take this forward, that isn't simply critique, and that isn't simply denial, and that isn't simply a kind of sense of helplessness in the face of structural forces that overwhelm us. We need to find some firmer ground. And I think the only way to do that, the only way to fight culture wars, for example, is not to throw back other culture wars, but it is precisely to be able to say what drives them, what lies under them, and how do we get at that? And that's a little bit of what I try to get at through this notion of an ethos of political minimalism. So, to the extent that it kind of links some of the other chapters, I hope that it's a helpful contribution. But I mean, I think overall, what it does actually really is put some connections between some of the other really, really great chapters in the book. And those of you who are here who haven't picked it up or bought it or read some of the chapters, you really should, because it's a great view of where we're at, which poses more questions than you'll want to have the time to, or will have the time to answer, but in such a rich way. And I'm just really pleased that I was given the chance to be a part of it. So thank you to Juliano and to the other editors on the call as well for that opportunity.
Thank you so much, Simon. And thanks for contributing so much along the way, and not just in terms of your chapter, but also in discussions. In fact, as all the three of you have contributed in many different ways. And in fact, you reminded me there to do the obligatory promo bit. So if you haven't yet got the book, you can pick up a copy on the Hurst website. Particularly if you're in the UK, please go to the Hurst website, where you can get a 25% discount with the code Debris in capitals 25, Debris 25. If you're in Europe outside of the UK, or I should just say nowadays, if you're in Europe, you can purchase a copy on Book Depository, and otherwise you can purchase from reputable and non-reputable bookshops. Your chapter, Simon, going back to it, gives the impression of a certain fluidity, a sort of a spilling outwards from the nation state with ordering processes, but also, in fact, the way that ordering internationally is used to reinforce the power of ideology and of the nation state itself. And that's something that is present in some of the other chapters, certainly in Fernando Espada's chapter, in Mark Duffield's chapter, I think comes through in my chapter. And I only read your chapter after I'd finished mine, and I immediately thought that there were great synergies. In fact, I thought that there were different pieces of the same jigsaw to some extent, partly because I'm also in my chapter, which I'll discuss very briefly so that we can get into a conversation with others. I'm also in some sense dealing with the end of utopia, the idea that utopia was no longer possible, that there was no longer a utopian horizon. Now, I was trying to tackle three questions. I don't know really whether I thought I could answer them, but explore three questions. The first is, what is the nature of this crisis? If there is a crisis of liberalism or of liberal order, what is it? Is it a crisis of legitimacy? Is it a political crisis? Is it a crisis of ideas? And I wanted to do that with I had no interest in offering an apology for liberal order, but I also wasn't interested in facile invective. Partly because I think there is a tendency, particularly on the left, to fall into an all too easy anti-liberalism when critiquing liberal order. And I say that as somebody on the left, not just because there's no Marx without Ricardo in that sense. It's more generally a sense that, well, I wouldn't want to live in an anti-liberal society, that intellectually I'm interested in understanding process of liberal ordering, because politically I'm interested in surpassing them. I'm interested in surpassing liberal capitalism. And so the question that I was trying to come to was, how can we understand the way in which a dialectic of liberal capitalism, that is the development of its internal contradictions, might contribute to the frustration of certain hopes of liberals themselves, but not just liberals. And I talked at the beginning in the introduction about a sort of declinism, the idea that liberalism has come to an end, or liberal order has come to an end. And this isn't just a trend within liberals or among liberal commentators and politicians, but also particularly, in fact, it's visible among conservative commentators, people like Patrick Deneen and Robert Emmett Tyrrell Jr., who declared the end of liberalism all too quickly. And I think in doing so, they don't come to terms with the role that liberalism has played in capitalist modernity. And that is, from my perspective, its role in moderating social expectations, and therefore its role in setting a certain idea, collective idea of time and temporality. And so that brings me on to the second question that I was trying to tackle, which is that I feel that there is something of a confusion with respect to the crisis at the moment. And not just the crisis of liberalism, but I think there's a degree of confusion generally with respect to the current disorder. And more generally still, with respect to what I would call a crisis of ideology, that is an apparent inability of ideology any longer to maintain what Olivia refers to as the lie. And I think that confusion is derived from, over the past 4 decades at least, a generalization of a metaphysical idealism. I'm not just saying that because I'm not personally an idealist in that sense, but I think that there's a confusion as to what is the role of imagination in historical process. Reimagining. We talk a lot about how we can reimagine things and what the impact of reimagining might be. But at the same time as we talk about reimagining, we also talk about challenging or changing structures. And I think that's where the confusion lies. And I think that's often where we come up against slightly mixed or paradoxical ideas about what is happening to liberalism itself. So the second question I was trying to ask is, what is the role of imagination? It's a big question. What's the role of imagination in historical process? More specifically, what has been the role of a humanitarian imagination over the last 40 years, let's say since the crisis of capitalist democracy in the 1970s? And finally, my third question sort of inverted that, which is, what happens politically when a particular imagination is extinguished or exhausted? So I said I was trying to deal with what happens at the end of utopia. And I suppose in some sense, my starting point is to think about the idea of the end of history. And it's often been derided as sort of a naive concept that history could come to an end, and particularly Fukuyama derided as some sort of liberal zealot. But it's obviously an idea that runs throughout the philosophy of history. And I tried to give something of a materialist explanation for that collective sense that history had closed, that there was no longer a possibility of looking outwards to a different sort of future, and suggesting that in fact our temporal imagination is also is linked to a spatial one, and suggesting that that sense of a closure of history, the end of utopias, was linked very much to the global expansion of capitalism. The idea that there were no longer new territories, new spaces to dominate, to colonize, and therefore the possibility that there was anything beyond the liberal capitalist present from the perspective of those living in the West became very difficult. And where does humanitarianism come in? Well, if there was this collective sense of a closure of history that was expressed in popular culture and in theory in the probably from the late 1950s onwards, certainly in the 1960s and 1970s, what came next? What was it that defined a political imagination to the extent that there was a collective political imagination in the West afterwards? And what came next, as many have identified previously, was an idealism. It wasn't an end of idealism. It was an idealism defined by a pursuit of life, and an inclusive pursuit of life, at least in rhetoric, linked to human rights. And Samuel Moyn, of course, has talked about the last utopia of human rights. I draw on that idea, and I suggest that rather than, as Samuel Moyn suggests, the last utopia being the last utopia because other utopian projects simply exhausted themselves or came to an end, that the last utopia is in fact a negative utopia. It's a utopia that's defined by its negation of all other utopias. And that negation was about maintaining a certain present. It's about not wanting to go beyond the present, because going beyond the present created the possibility of a totalitarian type of society and state. And therefore, what was needed was a sort of pacification of social rebellion and the eradication of need. And this produced what I refer to as the society of the humanitarian minimum, which obviously then has great synergies with what Simon discussed in terms of a political minimum. Just to conclude, what I suggest has come to an end over recent years isn't liberal order itself. It's not any particular structures. Biden got elected. Might we go back to the normal order of things previously? Who knows? But what I say has been existentially challenged is the political imagination of the last 40 years, and that there's no longer any possibility of maintaining the idea that we can just hold on to that present as a sort of negative utopia. And that has produced, in my view, a sort of melancholia that runs throughout society. I don't mean that as a sort of individual psychological breakdown, but as something that changes what Raymond Williams called the structures of feeling, and that produces other sorts of reactions: anger, disillusionment. And at the same time, I hope, and this is where I don't get to in the chapter, but what I would like to maybe write about at some point, is that melancholia can also be useful to thinking about our current situation, our current conjuncture, and for people who are interested in moving beyond the status quo, thinking about how a fragmentation of society can itself become instrumental to the recreation and transformation of society. That was a very quick overview, but I'd like to get into some questions and statements. I can see there's something in the chat here. Oh, that's Charlotte writing about the book. Thanks, Charlotte. I'm going to pass back to Charlotte, maybe just to open us out into questions with any thoughts on the presentations that we've given. But I do encourage you to write stuff in the chat if you'd like to, or put your hand up. Any of the authors, I can see there's a number now who have joined, so thanks for joining. But over to you, Charlotte.
Thanks, Juliano. I really enjoyed listening to all four of you talking about your chapters, and I thought, again, as the historian, Nimi talking about being able to see the through lines between these humanitarian stories, Olivia talking about looking at the lie, but specifically looking at how the lie can be rooted in kind of a learned and intentional amnesia and a kind of denial of the past. Simon talking about the sustained myths of humanitarian identity, and Juliano, you talking about this kind of declinism and the idea of utopias as endings rather than as things that open up the future. I think all four of those things to me made me think very much about the role that history has sometimes in shutting down change, right? The role that history can have in kind of seeing almost as if it limits possibilities. And it made me think about sometimes, you know, historians' role sometimes is to say none of this is new, right? Sometimes we find ourselves popping up and saying none of this is new, right? There has always been racism. Humanitarianism has always been shaped by imperialism. It has always perpetuated inequality, right? This is a kind of inherency to the sector and to the concept, but it's difficult to know what to do with that. Like, as a historian, if you say none of this is new, are we saying, so what, so none of this will ever change? Are we saying that we need to sort of, you know, it can be very frustrating to fight against people's denial of this history, but the denial of that history often has a very clear practical function. As Olivia was saying, you know, sometimes these lies do things that enables other people to move quickly and get things done. And it's those of us who get caught up with the lie, who get caught up with trying to pull out exactly why these things aren't true. We're the ones who find ourselves bogged down in these debates, you know. And I think sometimes as the historian saying none of this new, it makes you sound cynical, but it makes you into a cynic as well. It makes it difficult for you to understand how these things can kind of move forward. So I'm not sure if I can phrase that as a question, and I would really like to hear from some of the other people who kind of contributed, and from those of you who've given talks today. But that kind of sense of, well, what do we do with this knowledge actually? You know, how can we move forward from this? And the only other thing I wanted to kind of pull out was, you know, the introduction to the book really nicely sets out this kind of populist moment. And I think sometimes historians, or particularly history students, when they look back, we'll see populism and COVID as the same thing, right? It all happened at the same time, but populism came first actually, and then we had the pandemic. We're going to have an economic crisis after this, a global economic crisis, and we are in the middle of an ecological disaster. You know, we are in the middle of, I'm not getting any kind of cheerier in terms of where we go from the future here, but I think, you know, we are at a moment where a lot of these kind of end of history things, any one of those things happening might have been identified by future historians as being the end of a liberal order. And we have all of them happening at the same time, which I think is one of the reasons why it can be quite difficult to work out where we go forward from this, because these things are so, it's difficult as an individual or even as an organization to understand how you remake a world in that context. So that was just my very kind of brief thoughts, and then I'd love for other people to have thoughts.
Thank you, Charlotte. Do we have any comments or questions from anybody else? Anybody like to make an intervention? Any of the authors, any of the other editors? Otherwise, we can keep going. Rafia, who's, as I mentioned, one of the other editors. Hi, Rafia. Has posted here, in this post-COVID moment, the world is being divided up between people who have the vaccine and people who do not, with travel restrictions reflecting this. How do the arguments in the book align with these divided world? And it's great that Bertrand's just put his camera on, because in fact, Bertrand's chapter does touch on the pandemic, on big pharma and its role now, but it's much broader than that. Bertrand's argument goes back into the place of humanitarian things in the construction of liberal order. So maybe, Bertrand, you can have a go at tackling that question while talking a little bit about your chapter.
Well, which of the questions? The relevance of the relevance of climate change, or
No, I was talking about Rafia's question here in the chat, but feel free to touch on any of the others as well.
Well, look, yeah, my chapter was about where do we find liberal values, and where do we find humanitarianism in relation to capitalism, essentially. I mean, I call it liberal values of things, because I paid attention to the, tried to pay some attention to the processes of how humanitarian actors connected with their industrial setting, promoted their industrial setting, and were in fact very much part and parcel of a process of normalization of care and aid in the 19th and 20th century, and disconnected at some stage by proposing a critique of the big pharma, which had hitherto supported them. And in an interesting closure to the story, perhaps, but this is an interesting debate, actually still ongoing, of course, the possibility for big pharmaceutical companies to reinvent themselves a humanitarian identity through this current crisis and reinvigorate their own value system by engaging in the production of vaccines and the reimagining of a medical future. So that's the tension. Of course, it's not completely resolved. It's ongoing. It's an interesting debate within humanitarian circles at the moment about how do you relate to your pharmaceutical industry? How do you relate to the providers of the goods that you're circulating? And part of my argument is that, ironically, some of the anti-big pharma practices of the humanitarian today, in fact, resemble those guys who actually outsource industrial production and promote a form of globalization. I mean, but also, ironically, by lowering the price of drugs, humanitarians sometimes also make the bed for big pharma. So there is an interesting tension, or at least a potential debate. And at the heart of my paper, and the heart of a lot of other papers, is what forms does liberalism take, and what forms what kind of trades does it engage with, and how do we sort of chart those? Historically is always quite tricky, because these are very complex relationships with industrial producers. I'm thinking of the work of other historians, for example, Lola Willem, looking at Nestle and humanitarianism, and how Nestle, once upon a time, was a great humanitarian company before a boycott of Nestle by humanitarians challenged that identity. So things like that. That's what my paper was about. I think the interesting thing about COVID is of course its potential to be reinvented and reinvigorated, and to re-energize mechanics of control and forms of passporting, internal passporting, external passporting, and forms of social exclusion, which we thought we had done away with. And that's really one of the really striking feature. I'm thinking of what the French government is currently doing with the sort of health passports, which will, in many ways, reinvent an internal passport for French citizens.
And I think that raises quite an interesting question for humanitarian agencies, to the extent that they've been talking about certification and passports for humanitarian workers for quite some time, and what a certification of a humanitarian worker looks like when you have to carry different sorts of health passports as well, might raise some interesting challenges. Not only the role of big pharma becomes very the necessary point of discussion, but also how billionaire philanthropy sits alongside that. And billionaire philanthropy is the object of the study of Serene Carter in this book. But we've also seen Gates and Open Society Foundation and others stepping in to cover the gaps left by cuts in UK aid in the last few days. And so how that also contributes to different forms of social control, I think, is an interesting question that we don't get onto in the book, but one to be addressed in the coming times. Maybe we can get back to Mark. Yeah, by all means, mic open. Your microphone, Mark.
Thank you. Yeah, just some comments on all of the excellent presentations and themes that have emerged, and just an attempt to kind of link a few things together. Not very well, I must admit, but you know, why not? I mean, in terms of starting off and like where we are, I kind of think there's been talking about death of liberalism, all that kind of thing, that maybe we've seen a period of liberal overreach, a spatial territorial overreach, especially with the war on terror and the setback in the Middle East. And what we're seeing now is a period of recalibration. I wouldn't call it death, I wouldn't call it decline, I'd just say recalibration, including, emergence of the new right, new politics and so on. And definitely part of that liberal overreach has been the crusading humanitarianism that emerged in the 70s and gathered momentum in the 90s. And I really think this idea of the lie is very interesting. And the only way that it makes sense to me to talk about it is to try to think about if there's something we could call humanitarian imperialism. It's not like the classic imperialism of the 19th century, but it's an imperialism all the same. And I think the telling sign that it's an imperialism is that it's based on this idea of a blank slate, a blank card, a terra nullis. Humanitarian interventions take place in this vacuum, and I also think it's an imperialism because what you see, especially I think in the 70s onwards, humanitarianism, modern humanitarianism, re-establishes the link between Black sovereignty and crisis, permanent emergency. And this creates the basis of terra nullis, the ability to intervene. But I think why it's a different imperialism is that it depends on proxies. It depends on not only the private sector, NGOs, it depends on local actors, governments, local governments and so on. It's a complex imperialism based on proxies. And so it's full of complicities. And what interests me is the way that long-term humanitarian interventions can continually set the clock to year zero. South Sudan's a classic example. Every time there's a new rejigging of the aid regime, like the peace deal or the separation, everything goes back to year zero. And I think it's this way of perpetuating the lie. The lie has an institutional basis that reproduces itself. And of course, this inability to see the world as it is, which I now think it reaches insane proportions. I just think people in the aid sector are insane, or that they're subject to some form of hysteria. They just cannot see the world as it is. They cannot see their place in the world. They can't see them as connected to it. And I see it as a mental illness. I don't know, there seems to be something wrong there. Anyway, what's left? I mean, in terms of decolonization, I think it should be destroyed, the aid industry. I don't think it has any progressive future. But when I say it should be destroyed, I think it should be used. It should be subverted from within. And that if it has a use, it's a temporary use as a means of subverting the system from within. And in terms of the object, I think, of a subverted humanitarianism, it must be focused on the repoliticization of the camp. What I mean by the camp, it struck me how because of the success of the neoliberal revolution, it's been extremely successful in eliminating all forms of autonomy, all forms of spaces where we could regroup and mobilize, like the university, like other things, trade unions, they've all gone. And more of the resistance movements that we see seem to be around creating spaces, temporary spaces for social reproduction, such as camps that become self-sustaining, occupations of squares and streets. It's phenomenal the way that the most modern resistance takes this form of a camp, completely inverting Agamben, the camp as a form of life. And I think a subverted humanitarianism is allied to those forms of resistance. Because I kind of think, Charlotte mentioned the fact that the UK has cut its aid budget. And yes, there was a chance that Tory rebels would have may have overturned that. But I'm a bit more skeptical. The argument is that cut in aid means that lots of people are going to die, and so it has to be reinstated. But there's an interesting thought experiment, I think, that sums up the aid industry. And that's it. The aid industry first got involved in South Sudan in the 1970s. And what would have happened if they had not been drawn in the 1970s? And I'm thinking of all of the aid diversion. I'm thinking of the militarization. I'm thinking of the rolling pork barrel of the peace process. I'm thinking of corruption. I'm thinking of the corruption of the aid industries, the career ladders in the aid industries. Now, I think it's hard to believe that there would have been so many deaths if the aid agencies had stayed away in the 1970s. So I kind of think that that's how we have to look at this issue about, you know, what should be saved or what should be subverted from within. And that's, well, that's my contribution anyway, but great talk, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark, for that intervention, for your great chapter, and also for your contribution along the way, the friendship and the chats. There's probably nobody who knows the humanitarian industry, as you put it, in the same way as you do. There's nobody who has analyzed it so acutely over the last couple of decades. And so that idea of destroying but subverting from within is one that I think should stay with us, and we should be thinking about. I know we've actually come to the end of our time. I don't think this thing auto-destructs. I hope it doesn't anyway. So I'm going to suggest we keep going for a little longer. If you have to go, you drop off, and if the recording finishes, then so be it. This point about subverting from within, I think this is something that brings us to really what was behind the third question of the volume. So what are the implications for humanitarianism of these challenges to liberal order? We weren't, in asking that question or posing that question, trying to rescue liberal humanitarianism or humanitarianism in its contemporary form, institutional form, or the humanitarian industry as such. What we say is we obviously are trying to think about a politics of life that does something positive and progressive for societies, for the world, for humanity. But that doesn't necessarily look the same way. And I'm not sure, Klaus, if you're able or willing to talk about your chapter, but you talk about the possibility of a new mode of humanitarian activism that you see emerging in the Mediterranean, different sorts of movements that have some sort of horizontalist aspect, but also tie into existing humanitarian agencies. Gareth, your chapter reflects on the corporatization of the humanitarian sector over the last few decades to be able to think about subverting within as praxis. So I don't know if either of you two would like to say something. Feel free. You don't have to. We can continue with the rest of us if you prefer.
I mean, you know, I'll say something if you ask me to, Juliano. Should we see if Klaus wants to speak
to be honest. Go for it.
I'm just going to turn my camera off because the kids are home from school in Wales and it's messing with the signal. I think I've lost him.
No, we've got you. We've got your mic.
Oh, you've got me. Yeah, I mean, this is fascinating because I'm all about the idea of subverting from within. I mean, that's the whole purpose of the Humanitarian Affairs agenda inside Save the Children. And it's interesting the reaction we get from that. Shout if you're not hearing me, but I think you are.
We've got you.
What's fascinating is in this debate, not only, I just came off a call this morning with a bunch of CEOs of the big agencies, and everyone's reflecting on what happened yesterday with the aid cuts. And on one hand, there's the lament about the inconvenience to the business model in terms of, oh gosh, we're all going to have less money and being smaller. And there's a legitimacy to that in the sense that most CEOs in a world of increasing need still equate growing with meeting that increasing need. I mean, it's a shorthand. But there's also some who see it as opportunity. To sort of get back to the activism and all the rest of it. That's at the heart of the origins of many organizations. But the problem in the wider sense, and we're involved in a study with 50 CEOs, and we're meeting tomorrow on this, is that there is it's a sort of, what I call a sort of systemic immunity to change. That's very apparent in our system, in the formal humanitarian system, and of course the formal humanitarian system being a product of the liberal order. So on one level, there's sort of philosophical and intellectual will amongst a lot of CEOs of mainstream NGOs who don't really want to preside over, they don't want their legacy to be, one that's morally or ethically questionable in the way it so blatantly sort of is now around the sort of industrialization and the sort of business interests. But everyone's stuck. They don't really know how to get out of this. But I think it's why I find this kind of stuff that we're doing in the book and everything else so important is I think it is softening up the sort of the hard edges of thinking, and eventually it makes its way to boardrooms, which really is ultimately who call the shots. I mean, there is a cascading kind of tyranny of compliance in aid that comes down through the liberal order, through charity commissions in the UK, into boardrooms, into CEO life, and it crowds out anything else. So, I hope that by fostering these kind of conversations, we start to attack the edges of that by emboldening some of the more progressive leaders. Let's see. But but the question of whether there'll be a more multipolar, aid ecosystem that emerges after the demise of the sort of conventional formal system, I think there's a lot of skepticism in leadership around that. People don't see strong evidence of that. But I think for me it's the idea that we create new power in lots of places in an ecosystemic way, which is the power of the kind of debates, rather than the idea that somehow the powerful elites of the past of an anachronistic old world order will somehow become enlightened. I very much doubt that. I'm not sure the historians could tell us whether that's ever been very successful. But the idea that we create new power, in new places, I think is a much more interesting idea.
Great, thanks a lot, Gareth. And for the record, none of this would have been possible without the space that Gareth provides. I say this every time, and we say it in the acknowledgement. The Humanitarian Affairs team, which is dedicated to critical reflection on humanitarian politics and practice, wouldn't have been created if Gareth hadn't have given us the space and then protected us for the last decade or so. So thank you to Gareth. I know that Klaus has to drop off in a few seconds, so I don't know if anybody else would like to make a comment on that same point. Okay, we've got Nimi and Bertrand. I'm just looking at the other screen. I think that's it. If not, if there is somebody else, please put your hand up. Olivia as well, and Simon. So we'll go in that order: Nimi, Bertrand, Olivia, Simon.
Yeah, I mean, I've been thinking about all of the comments. I speak about in the essay, speaking of billionaire philanthropy, a conference I did once that was Rockefeller funded that was called Reimagining refugee camps. Again, in a more naive existence of mine, that initially I thought, well, you can bring all these different actors, the architects and the NGOs and the scholars looking at these things towards a more effective kind of refugee camp. And again, I felt the disconnect was that we weren't speaking the same language, that the tension there was coming from each of us, speaking a different language. And I say this to say, and I reveal it to to emphasize the role of an evolving consciousness in this process. You know, that we all accept that our consciousness will keep shifting and should keep shifting in this way. That now to me is very clear that in the way that Olivia frames it, the divide was between those who articulate the lie and those who recognize the lie. I mean, that was sort of the divide in that room happening very viscerally in that moment, in the way that Simon referenced, you know, that this is how we speak to the world, the part of the world that we're speaking to, you know, myself included, the Tamils in Sri Lanka included, recognized the lie that was being told to them. And I think that it doesn't exist, that lie, without a mask, without bits of truth to keep it together, to allow it to take hold. No? So all of these things that came up, the language of neutrality, the language of benevolence, you know, all of that. And I like the way Olivia puts it as constitutive rather than a manifestation, right? And what is it constituting? It's constituting this identity, right? And that's where I think the tension became very clear, that identity, you know, that's read, as Simon says, through ethos, through dispositions, that's very much anchored in individualism, you know. And I liked Olivia's call for a project, right? A project to indiscriminate life, but this is a political project, right? The political project, you know, towards an indiscriminate life. And to me, the struggle has always been that needs space, right? And that project is a collective project, particularly in the developing world. It has always been a collective project, right? And that in itself, when we talk about the politics that are evil, is not necessarily ideology. Collective in itself becomes a form of evil, you know, against the individual ethos, right? The individualist approach. And I think, you know, that really imagination and new forms of imagining requires space. And what I see in the aid world now, particularly with younger students and younger activists, is how constrained they feel, you know, by professionalism, by ideology, by bureaucracy, that they're all trying to live inside this captivity of the world, of the industry, right? And that space is not there for political imagination, first, but second, for any sort of progress towards a collective political project, right? And I think, you know, thinking about these two divides, those who articulate the lie and those who recognize the lie, and the question that Charlotte posed, for me, you know, each of us has a different role in the struggle, and I've always I've come to understand that mine is one to reveal, you know, to unmask things, right? But what is done with that, right? How you move forward from that, what I find most often, and what bridges this in any sense, is a mutual recognition of the lie. And that's what's missing, you know, is that there's an inability to, when, you know, myself and Rafia and Kate, you know, put forward a paper called Emissaries of Empowerment that sort of deconstructed the role of white feminism in the question of empowerment. And what I got most often from white feminists was, okay, yes, there's this depoliticizing happening. What's your solution? What's the recommendation? Oh, this kind of linear thinking that I see all the time with my policy students, right? But it's not simply linear. It's linear in a way that jumps over a part of it, right? There's not an ability to sit with the recognition that this is the process, that this is a reality that we all recognize as a lie. And it's that part, I think, the sitting with, that leads to a mutual recognition. And it's that part which is missing.
Brilliant. And I think it's worth stating that at the first reading, the book can appear slightly, it can give a sense of bleakness. one of our contributing authors, Eleanor Davey, has twice said to me, it's a great book and it's bleak. And at the same time, I feel that the work of trying to reveal through critique is also a hopeful work, and one that doesn't necessarily need to paint the path towards the different future, because the intention is very clear in the way that the chapters are written, that critique is instrumental to a project of transformation. And I think that's where the politics is fully on show in this book. I don't think we tried to hide, any of the authors really tried to hide behind a facade of neutrality or even objectivity in that sense. Beshran.
Yeah, difficult act to follow, Nimi, but I think there's a very what's striking in what Gareth was witnessing and is what some have called, the rule of freedom, the essential, the extraordinary ability of metamorphosis of liberal forms of oppression to present themselves as liberating forms of protection. And that's one of the striking features of the so-called professionalization agenda in the humanitarian world, is how it's actually shaped norms of behavior, some of which are on the face of it extremely vital and important, but actually has shaped them in such a way that they are becoming of themselves part of the structures of oppression within. And I think that's really, really striking, how this mechanism of control through liberty or through freedom, as Patrick Joyce might have put it in the past for the 19th century liberalism, is really at work still in the mechanics of monitoring that are applied in the humanitarian world. Now, if I go back to Mark's point, I think it's a really important point about the recalibration of liberalism, and this is me venturing a little bit, but I've got a sense that what we're seeing is a recalibration of liberalism on national basis, and where humanitarian aid and the aid industry, so-called, fits poorly with that recalibration of liberalism, is of course that it still hangs on to concepts of internationalism, which are rapidly falling out of fashion and are losing their political expediency and usefulness for liberalism. And I think this is where we're getting into an interesting position, which, as a historian, you've got to compare to the interwar period, where internationalism is actually inimical to new forms of solidarity, which can be racial or class-based or what have you, which are promoted by populist regimes.
I think that's a really important point, Bertrand, and connects to something we say in the introduction, which we point out a paradox, which is that exactly or precisely at the moment of the apparent crisis of liberalism is when we could actually perhaps read a renewal of the struggle to define what liberalism is, recalibrating liberalism. And that's a struggle which I think is reflective of the fact that to some extent everybody has become liberal in some sense. Everybody is struggling for the heart of liberalism within a world, and this is certainly my take, not suggesting it's others, in a world without an obvious future. And I think that's relevant to debates currently about the return of the state or apparent return of the state, and whether that means the end of neoliberalism. And I think there's some confusion here, which I think, Simon, you could probably address as to what liberalism and neoliberalism do and are as ideologies, not just as bounded sets of ideas. There are strains within neoliberal thought which aren't so globalist, which think about the movement of capital without necessarily the movement of workers, and lend themselves to a more nationalist form of accumulation that use the state as a vehicle, like neoliberalism has done, creating barriers between the political and the economic. I'll hand over to Olivia and then Simon.
Thank you very much. So I saw that Charlotte left us, but I know we're recording, so I'll invite her too, because I really appreciated her question, mostly maybe to share that for me, the discovery that nothing is new has come to me recent years as deeply comforting. And it actually comes from the fact that I think I wasted half of my life trying to convince people that racism is a real thing, right? Or that humanitarianism or aid is detrimental to life of the majority of people on this planet. So the tiredness that comes from the defensive position that somebody mentioned, history is solace in there, right? The problem though, and I think her question is a really important one, like what do we do then? Mostly, how do we fight the despair of, you know, we've seen these a million times coming back, and that's the impatience I was talking about before. And I find myself reading out this first line of Sven Lindqvist's book, Exterminate All the Brutes, in many of the talks I've given in the last month. So it's somewhere there on YouTube as well. But I just thought that it is actually the answer for historians, or the answer of any of us trying to take history seriously beyond it already happened before. And so it reads, you already know enough, so do I. It is not knowledge that we lack. What is missing is the courage to understand what we know and to draw conclusions. And so for me, this is where then the political, or both the political and the intellectual project comes in, where, let's say, if I engage in decolonial thought, that's how it allows me to kind of formulate or conceptualize what that might mean. And that means that, you know, you can use history to really look at the lie in detail, because the details actually do matter. So if I do this very quickly in terms of the present, then, or some of the points that were raised that I think really help us think. One is the thing about the vaccine, the other is the 0.7%. And then Garrett's, and yeah, very briefly, Mark, I am an abolitionist when it comes to humanitarianism or aid. So I completely agree with what you say in terms of, I think it's generative to think in terms of how do we abolish it, and then what is the shape of the responsibilities that are left, or the ways that we can engage with it. And then Garrett's point about the need for new power in new places. In terms of the vaccine, I think, or COVID-19, for me, is just such a straightforward shortcut to understand the profound lie that is in the concept and in this industry of aid or help, right? So when I hear French parliamentarians saying, oh, we're gonna give that million amount of vaccines somewhere there, or like all the politicians are saying this now, just sitting with that phrase, we're gonna give you vaccines, just as a sentence, very, like, we don't even need to have undergraduate students go a whole year through reading all the different things to understand how deeply flawed that is. Because, you know, everything we said about the pharmaceutical sector, but mostly, how did we end up in a world where some can give something that is obviously supposedly to be available to all, right? And it's an infrastructural, it's an institutional, it's a historical. You can break down the whole messed upness of this whole thing that we're talking about just in the statement, we're gonna give you some vaccines. It's absurd. So we don't have much time, so I don't need to go in more details. In terms of the 0.7%, I find myself in a not really in a bind, because for many different reasons than Boris and his friends, I don't think it's a bad thing, but it's just the reason why it came, the way it came about. And I also know the actual immediate consequences of the cuttings are not going to be positive. But one has to think, especially if we bring up the abolitionist thing then as well. I think the example that was given of aid in Sudan in the 70s, if we take that seriously, then we need to think what our critique is going to be specifically about the difference between 0.5 or 0.7. It has to be more profound than that, right? And again, I'm not saying like, oh, let's all celebrate this, because we know that it came from the wrong place for the wrong reason, and nothing is going to change through this cut. But analytically, we need to have the courage, I think, to look at it in the much longer term, in a different way. And then finally, in terms of new power in new places, I think what decolonial thought has helped me to work through is that in the same way that diversification, inclusion, and all of that, those are minimum conditions, right? So we've been hoarding the same way as the vaccine, we've been hoarding power somewhere in the white supremacist world with its proxies. So not everybody's white that has it or that does it, but you know, during colonial times, not all colonizers were white either. The challenge is, as a minimum condition, to obviously make power travel much more widely. But I think we radically need to rethink what power is supposed to do. And that's, I think, where the politics of life versus the politics of power for the sake of it are quite important. So just dislocating power into hands of others that don't look white or don't look Western, whatever, it's not the thing that's going to save us, but it's very much about thinking, how can we engage the desires for mastery and the death that comes from that that is so much embedded in our international system. And we don't need white people to do that, unfortunately, right? So this is where I would join Garrett in suggesting it needs to go to new places, but it needs to have a different purpose. Very profoundly. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks a lot, Olivia. And I think that's a good message for those within the humanitarian sector who are thinking about localization as the term and the agenda of localization. What it means to be localizing, shifting power is another phrase that's often used. What does it mean to be shifting power, and how can you think through shifting power politically in the way that you're suggesting? And finally, on to Simon. I think with Simon we will probably end. So Simon, you get the last word. I'd just like to say thank you to Nimi, who's dropped off, who has a newborn child and very generously offered us her time to talk today. So thanks so much, Nimi, and thanks for your contribution, Simon.
Thanks, Julian. So I am the end times. The conversation has moved to 100 kilometers since I put my hand up after Gareth spoke. But I mean, you know, Olivia, what you were just saying, it's absolutely right. This arch hypocrisy of offering to give to parts of the world what has already just literally been taken. I mean, it is the imperial experience we lived. You know, we take what is actually, if you believe those who talk about vaccines as a global public good, or at least access to vaccines as a global public good, because of course they're all invariably produced by private pharmaceutical companies, as you write about, Bertrand. Then that is arch hypocrisy that captures this view of what liberalism is and how the humanitarian agenda, as it were, kind of contributes to that. But I mean, Julian, you posed a question to me. My sense, two things have happened, broadly speaking, in and through COVID in terms of the discussion we're having. One is that we've moved to a defensive form that prioritizes freedom rather than equality, and for all the talk of solidarity through vaccines, that is absolutely not the case. That what we are doing is prioritizing some people over others, and what we are specifically doing is prioritizing the freedom of some people over others, their freedom to move, hence the vaccine passports, to the extent that we will even reintroduce internal passports. Equality, really speaking, is not a part of that, and it's definitely not a part of that with respect to the second trend I think we're seeing, and that is this shift away from the international domain, the falling away of the significance of internationalism to a liberal language, which perhaps was always a forced relation anyway. But now certainly we are seeing that is no longer central to what a kind of liberal position would argue for in the context of the current crisis. And I think that is actually something that opens up a huge moment of potential. One of the things that I wrote about a long time ago was about actually the production of pharmaceuticals in a non-Western context. And I think partly because of that, I've been drawn back into the discussion, particularly around the financing of vaccines. And a lot of the work I've been doing over the last 6 months or so has been discussing with people a little as Gareth's been doing, with sort of CEO level and boardroom level within the COVAX system, about what form of financing is necessary to solve the problem, because we have this absolutely incredible shortfall of billions of dollars, which is actually peanuts in respect to the money that's being spent by nations every single day of this crisis. And I think one of the most interesting things that's come out from me, and perhaps this is a moment of hope to finish upon, is that there is genuinely a sense that the language and the norms that we have that have sustained this kind of humanitarian present, as you describe it, Juliano, this refusal to give on to any other form of utopian or progressive politics, any form of inclusionary politics for that matter, is a moment in which new languages can be born. And I think that is something that you do see, not just on the streets, but actually you are seeing it genuinely in the boardroom level. And I don't know whether Gareth's experience will bear this out, but I think there's an opportunity to change the language and the norms through which we think about the principles of this dignity of life, as you've described it, Olivia. And I think actually that is something that we can grasp. I think it's something the book helps us to do. I think something in all of our different areas of expertise and the different parts of the political system we are engaged with, whether it's national, whether it's international, whether it's NGO, whether it's state, I think there is an opportunity there to change the language, so long as we grasp what it is that we want to do, and so long as we do, in a sense, understand that there's a history that can be built upon, and there's also, a clear sense of lessons learned. I know we don't like to talk about lessons learned, but there are insights that history can bring that will actually enable us to bring about that change in the language that's used. And I think that is the first step, actually, to addressing the structures of oppression that have become so dominant. And the fact that you see suddenly the Gates, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation being criticized openly, which for years it has not been. The fact that you see large international multilateral organizations speaking of a need for change on a scale of change that they didn't even speak about after the financial crisis of 2008-9. I think that's an indication that there are some cracks, as it were, through which light is beginning to get in. And I think that's the moment of opportunity that we can seize. And I think that's the moment of opportunity that this book speaks to. So thanks again for the chance to be part of the conversation.
Thank you, Simon. Good to finish on a hopeful note. I think, yeah, the opportunity of a new language lends itself to a different grammar of political practice, and I think that's what we're aiming for, and thinking that through the terms of humanitarianism. You talked about traveling hundreds of kilometers since Gareth had spoken. In fact, it is a book that travels a very long distance, spatially, temporally. It covers a lot of ground, but at the same time, I think it's a book with a few core messages, which I hope we've projected in this conversation today. At any rate, I hope you've enjoyed the conversation, found it stimulating and interesting. I very much encourage you to go and buy the book. You can learn more about the book on the Hurst website. I also encourage you to check out the websites of the speakers that I put in the chat, learn about them and their dazzling CVs. And finally, I'd like to say thank you, not just to everybody who's attending here, but in particular to my fellow editors, so to Bertrand, to Andrea, who's hosting this event today. Thank you, Andrea. To my longtime colleague and friend, Fernando, and also to Rafia. Your contributions to this project have been immense, not just intellectually and practically. And thanks to the authors, sticking to a commitment to contribute a chapter when so much else is going on, when particularly those within the university have all sorts of new administrative burdens, but those outside the university have new life burdens in the midst of a pandemic. It takes a commitment that's also personal, not just professional. So I thank you personally for that, and I think the book has benefited as a result. And on that note, I'll say goodbye and thanks, and I hope to see you soon.